I'm Christian Bryant. If you've been caught up in the twist of the news cycle, we are like storm chasers. We're gonna analyze things from a few different angles and possibly give you more information than you know what to do with. Here's what we're picking up on our radar. We're going to focus a bit on the country's southern border. The Biden administration announced plans to officially lift the controversial policy known as Title 42 on May 23rd. But there's growing concern that that move could lead to an influx of migrants at the southern border. Last year, migrant encounters more than doubled in all 9 southwest border sectors. That's according to Pew Research. On Thursday, a group of bipartisan senators introduced a new bill that would prevent the Biden administration from getting rid of the policy unless they could present a detailed plan to deal with an expected surge of migrants. The group of bipartisan senators plan to include their proposal as a part of a larger amendment to the $10 billion COVID funding bill. For a little background, Title 42 was first put into place March of 2020 under the Trump administration. The memo officially came from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which has the authority to do so under the 1944 Public Health Service Act. Basically, federal health officials can ban people and goods from entering the country in the case of a pandemic and in the interest of public health. Critics of the policy, which includes several public health experts, have said it's a misapplication of the law, arguing it was getting used because of immigration concerns, not public health worries. When President Biden took office, he promised a more humane approach to immigration, saying he would overhaul some Trump-era policies, but this one stuck around. In February of last year, Biden did sign an executive order exempting unaccompanied minors from expulsion under the policy. Still though, despite repeated calls to fully end Title 42, the CDC extended the policy in August of 2021. The arguments against the policy got even louder as vaccine rates increased and pandemic-era restrictions came to an end. Then, at the beginning of this month, the Biden administration said Title 42 would officially end in May. This is us getting you up to speed. To help us look at the impacts of ending the Title 42 policy and what we might expect when it's lifted, we're bringing in Teresa Brown, the Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Institute. Teresa, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, a recent study from the Migration Policy Institute showed that migrants from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras all had some of the highest expulsion rates since Title 42 went into effect. What are some of the conditions that these people were dealing with when they were sent back?
Well, one of the reasons that those 4 nationalities had the highest rates is because those were the nationalities that Mexico agreed to accept back under Title 42. So not only was Mexico taking back its own citizens when they were expelled from the United States, but they agreed to take back some of those Central Americans as well. And so not all of them would have been sent back to their home countries. Many of them ended up staying in Mexico and trying again. And so that's one of the reasons we have seen under Title 42 some of the highest rates of what we call recidivism or repeat attempts at coming into the United States than we have seen in decades. But most of the Central Americans, when they talk about why they decided to migrate or tried to come to the United States to seek asylum, most of them cited things like criminality in their home countries, being exposed to extortion or threats of violence and rape from criminal gangs in their region. Even if they had a little bit of income or business, they couldn't make ends meet because they were constantly being extorted and the government wouldn't do things about it. Some of them also were members of minority communities such as LGBTQ communities that faced persecution in their countries. Others just found that their economic situation was no longer sustainable. You think about Guatemala and the natural disasters that have hit Central America that have made those who relied on subsistence farming unable to continue to do that. And then they couldn't find other economic ways of sustaining themselves in their countries. So there's a lot of different reasons that cause many of the migrants to come, but almost all of them cite the fact that they felt like either they would not be able to survive if they stayed in their country, either economically or frankly physically due to rates of violence and threats.
There are growing concerns that border communities will be overwhelmed once this policy is lifted. Is there anything that should be done to better prepare for a possible influx, especially considering the surge we've seen of migrants at the border in the last year?
When Title 42 has been in operation, more than half of those arriving were expelled. So it's important to understand that if Title 42 comes down, the number of people that Border Patrol or CBP officers at ports of entry will have to take into custody and process through some sort of formal process will increase. It may not sufficiently double because of that recidivism issue that we talked about before, but it will mean probably that many more will be put into some sort of proceedings inside the United States, immigration court proceedings. Now, some portion may also be put back into the revived migrant protection protocols or remain in Mexico policy that the Biden administration was ordered to reinstate last year by the courts. But one of the things that we hope that DHS would be doing is talking to those communities, talking to the shelters and the non-governmental organizations, the charitable organizations that have been the ones that have been receiving the migrants, to make sure that there's adequate resources available and adequate capacity to handle the migrants after they're released from CBP custody.
I'd be remiss if we didn't also talk about, some of the folks in positions of leadership in states kind of bordering our U.S. southern border. I'm curious to know, what do you think Texas Governor Abbott meant earlier this week when he said he plans to take unprecedented action to secure Texas borders?
It's worth noting that under federal law, states do not have unilateral authority to secure the state border. And nor do they have unilateral authority to take into custody immigrants and transport them anywhere. Transporting them across state lines would invoke federalism issues, obviously. So it's unclear exactly what the governor meant. I would certainly envision that should this start happening, there would be lawsuits against these actions, just as the administration has faced lawsuits against its actions. That's something that overhangs all of these conversations, is the level of litigation over immigration policy in this country right now is pretty much unprecedented.
One other thing that's kind of top of mind for many of us, we've been watching so much kind of unfold in Ukraine. Have we started to see any impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the border, the U.S. southern border?
We have seen a few thousand Ukrainians who have arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border seeking to enter to ask for asylum. Originally, many of them were expelled under Title 42. However, Customs and Border Protection issued a memo a couple of weeks ago now advising officers at ports of entry that they did have the ability on a case-by-case basis to exempt the Ukrainians from Title 42 and allow them in to apply for asylum. So that has been happening more frequently. President Biden announced when he was in Poland that the United States would accept up to 100,000 Ukrainians. He didn't provide any information as to how Ukrainians might actually come to the United States. The regular refugee process can take several years. Even immigrant visas could take a year and a half or more, depending on what type of visa Ukrainian might qualify for. So without any information about or any understanding of other ways that Ukrainians could come to the United States, particularly Ukrainians that have family members or other ties to the U.S., they're finding any way they can, and they're finding the Mexico border to be the most expeditious means. I do think that this is an ongoing question and issue. If the administration really wants to open avenues for Ukrainians seeking protection to come to the United States, he's going to have to let those be known fairly soon, or we're going to continue to see, I think, Ukrainians arriving in larger numbers at the borders.
I appreciate you really just kind of laying out the complexity of the situation and how complicated it may be to even make it here in the first place. Teresa Brown is the Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Institute. Teresa, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.